Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Kurt Malchow and I'm the project lead for the 2014 California Department of Fish and Wildlife Climate College. Thank you for joining us today in this sixth out of seven final lecture series of the course. This class was co-organized through the Sonoma County Water Agency and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and made possible through the Farallon Institute and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Just some housekeeping. For those of us live at the facility, please sign in. There's two sign-in sheets circulating around here, and please mute your cell phones. Most of our attendees will be calling in through WebEx. We have about 70 that have registered. Those users will be muted for recording, but can submit questions during the Q&A session through the chat feature. So I'll be going back and forth with questions between live and WebEx users. And some reminders, please, if you're CDF staff, please register for credit. Even if you're non-CDF staff, we have a link for you to register for automatic reminders for the class. We have a department colleague with us, Brett Kormos, who is a senior environmental scientist with the department, who is going to help co-moderate the Q&A session to better cover any connection between today's lecture topics and marine region activities. To facilitate such discussion, we're going to have a sample list of issues also on our Q&A slide. I've had these up in the past couple of classes, and just to guide any questions to that effect. We have additional course details on our website. We have recordings of all our previous classes, so please visit this page for updates on our final class and for any necessary review. As a quick recap, the past 4 lectures have focused on physical changes to marine systems from climate change. More specifically, we've heard presentations on climate impacts to wind, weather, currents, ocean temperatures, coastal fog, hypoxia, ocean acidification, sea level rise, and extreme events, with some incidental discussion on the potential effects of these changes on marine ecology. This class, for the first time, will focus on climate impacts to marine ecosystems. We are pleased to have with us 2 scientists who have worked extensively and often together on these areas of research. I will introduce them both at one time in order of their discussions. Dr. Bill Peterson has worked at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center's Newport Field Station since September 1995. He came to Newport from NOAA Fisheries headquarters, where he served for 3 years as the director of the U.S. GLOBEC Interagency Program Coordination Office. Prior to that, he worked in Monterey, California with the National Ocean Service as a supervisory physical scientist. In that role, he supervised the activities of 15 scientists associated with the Center for Ocean Analysis and Protection. Other areas where he has worked include the University of Cape Town in South Africa, the Sea Fisheries Research Institute, and as an assistant professor at the State University of New York at Stony Brook on Long Island, New York. Bill's chief research interest is to study the effects of climate variability and change on zooplankton and pelagic fish populations, particularly juvenile salmonids, in the Northern California current region. He also leads an active research program on euphausid or krill ecology and biology. He uses high-frequency acoustics to study distributions of zooplankton and fish and the spatial interactions of these taxa within the physical ocean environment. Bill is active in the Pisces program, serving as the chairman of the Regional Experiments Committee. He has helped organize the annual conference of the Ecology of Juvenile Salmonids and is a member of the organizing committee for the forthcoming 3rd International Symposium on Zooplankton Production. Bill serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Plankton Research and is an anonymous referee with the Marine Ecology Progress Series. He is an adjunct professor of oceanography at the College of Oceanographic and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University, serves on several Ph.D. committees, and advises graduate students. Dr. Bill Sydeman's career exceeds 3 decades of ecological research. Starting as an intern marine ornithologist working on the Farallon Islands in 1981, Bill spent 15 years as the director of marine ecology at PRBO Conservation Science before establishing the Farallon Institute. Bill obtained his Ph.D. in ecology from the University of California at Davis. Bill has conducted a number of plankton to predator studies in the California current large marine ecosystem and has written about seabirds, marine mammals, and various fish species. In recent papers, Bill described dramatic and abrupt ecosystem changes to climate variability. Bill serves on many scientific panels, notably as the chair of the advisory panel for marine birds and mammals for the North Pacific Marine Science Organization, and Scientific Advisory Committee for implementation of the State of California's Marine Life Protection Act. Bill is presented to state and federal policymakers on the effects of climate change on marine ecosystems and how to best design and use the nation's new ocean observing systems. Please join me in welcoming Drs. Bill Peterson and Bill Sydeman.
Well, thanks, Kurt. I guess I have done a lot of things. Oh, my gosh. Okay, well, I'm going to begin my talk with the slide that no one has shown you before, but it's a slide that I think is an important one to see. It's nothing to do with my talk, but it's a slide you need to be aware of. Atmospheric CO2 measured at Mauna Loa, Hawaii. This is on a big island. How many of you know why this thing has this kind of a zigzag pattern to it? Anybody know why it is? Why it goes up and down? Yeah, it's the summer. Northern summer. Now, it's always impressed me how much northern summer pulls the CO2 down just from having trees out there, and probably your lawn maybe helps too. If you guys have lawns, you don't have lawns anymore, right? But yeah, it's pretty amazing. A lot of people don't notice that in this slide, that it has this sawtooth thing. But the other thing you notice in the slide is, well, there's the annual cycle of averaged over. You can see where starting around May, the CO2 starts to drop. And it drops around 2 or 3 parts per million, which is a lot of CO2 to pull out of the air. The other thing, look at this slide, is you can see that that's not a straight line. It's gone exponential slightly, enough to be really troubling. And this is a slide that I entered at 29. We're already, I think we hit 390, I think this year. Maybe 392. We're getting close to was like 450 or so is where people think all hell's going to break loose. So, but anyhow, I was surprised no one's shown this, Kurt, in any other talks. So, but this is a critical issue, I think. Okay, enough of that. Now I'll talk about plankton for a while. Am I going the right way here? There we go. Okay, I spent a lot of time working up off Oregon. Well, this little red circle is where Oregon kind of is. But I'm involved in a program that does a lot of sampling off the Oregon coast and Washington coast of plankton and the juvenile salmon. Okay, so we're trying to give managers advice on kind of outlooks of where salmon returns are headed in the future, and advice on how salmon returns are kind of driven by what we call ocean conditions. And this takes up really a lot of my intellectual time as well. So what I remind people when I give a talk like this is that when you study the ocean off of Oregon, or even off Northern California, or Southern California, or Central California, that large-scale forces have a huge influence on the ocean out here. Okay, it's not just the winds in the summertime or whatever. It's a thing called the PDO, which is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which I'll touch on. Nate Mantua covered this some weeks ago in his class. ENSO, you know about ENSO? There's a big El Nino brewing at the equator right now. A big one probably brewing right now. We'll know in another month or two whether it's going to be big or not so big. And then there's local conditions that affect the ocean off the coast here, which is upwelling, which I think you know something about. There's an event called the spring transition. That's when upwelling kind of begins. And the coastal currents themselves have an impact on what happens in that little red circle there. Big impacts on the food chain. That's where I'm coming from, is how is the food chain off Oregon and off the coast here affected by the PDO, by ENSO, by upwelling, and by the currents. So we talk about bottom-up processes, which means from the phytoplankton to the zooplankton up to the small fish and then onto the predators. And then we talk about top-down processes, which is the predators eating the forage fish, which eat the zooplankton and which eat the phytoplankton. Then there's a little salmon right in that box right there, who goes to sea, has a little fish about 6 inches long or so. He has he has 2 things on his mind: finding something to eat, and finding himself not being eaten. Okay, it's a simple life. So in any case, this talk will focus a bit on climate variability and how it affects basically the food chain off the coast of Oregon and Northern California. The marine food chain, I probably should say. Observations that we take, we've been sampling juvenile salmon in May, June, and September since 1998 at all these places along the coast, from La Push, which is the tip of Washington State, down to as far as Newport, pretty much. So from about 45 to 48 north, okay? We sample the Newport line, which is right here, every other week. This is our 19th year. If you can picture a program going on that long. And I got a tremendous staff that's dedicated to this program, and every 2 weeks we get to see almost without fail. Then there's historical data on hydrography. That means the water temperature, the salinity in the 60s that we can draw upon. Zooplankton from the 70s, and some data from 83 by Charlie Miller, other people in the early 90s. Then juvenile salmon data that Bill Piercy collected in the early 80s. I'll talk about probably none of this stuff on this slide, but just show you roughly where we do our work, okay? Zooplankton, do you know what zooplankton are? Everybody know what they are? The little guys that eat the phytoplankton, and the forage fish eat the zooplankton, right? So there's two kinds that we deal with here. One are the copepods, which is that guy in the upper left panel there. That's a Calonus. And just for reference, the panel on the upper right there, the largest copepod up there, if I can get this to work, this guy is the same as this guy here, okay? And this animal, this is a krill, this is about 1 inch long. So your scale is 1 inch. This copepod is whatever, I don't know. I don't do inches, but it's like 4 millimeters, okay? And this copepod here is a Neocalonus. This copepod appeared on the front page of the Portland Oregonian in 2008. It's got to be the first record of copepod being on the front page of a major newspaper. Put that in your fact sheet. And then the critical thing about copepods, in the bottom right is a krill. Copepods, some species pack on a lot of fat. And these are the source of omega-3 fatty acids that show up in salmon, okay? And they get these fatty acids from eating diatoms, okay? Big part of my talk. This other slide, just some pictures of 4 kinds of copepods, 4 really very different types, just to show you that these things are incredibly beautiful when they're alive. You put formaldehyde in them or alcohol on them and their color disappears in a matter of hours. But these are some really beautiful images that we've taken over the years of these guys. So, all right. So the climate, there's kind of 4 important physical features that affect the food chain off the coast of the Northern California current, I'll call it. So large-scale circulation patterns control the kind of water that comes into the California current. The California current is part of a bigger global current system. There's reversals of these currents in the wintertime. I'll talk about upwelling a little bit, and then talk about this thing called the PDO, which Mantua discussed at great length, but I'll briefly touch on it just to refresh your memory from what he'd said. And everything I'll talk about today is actually on the web. It'll be on, I guess, your guys' web page too, of course. But we have a web page at our center in Seattle. And on the first opening part of the web page, there's a little button that says salmon forecasting. You click on that button, it'll take you to everything that we do with respect to the work off Oregon that we use to kind of to actually forecast the salmon. I will not discuss salmon forecasting today, other than to say that zooplankton forecasts salmon pretty well. It's pretty cool, it really is. Okay, Oceanography 101. This is the North Pacific Ocean, and this is us, roughly right about here. This body of water here is called the California Current. Okay, it's part of a big gyre, North Pacific Current, the Kuroshio Current, North Pacific Current. And up here, this was called the Subarctic Current. So we have 2 currents coming at us from the west, and they split just off the coast of Oregon, pretty much. So some of the water goes to the north, some of the water goes to the south. It turns out to make a huge difference as to how much water comes into this current from this part of the current versus this part of the current. And that'd be part of my talk today. So we need to know where the water's coming from to understand what's causing the California current to be variable. And the reason for that is because zooplankton are like little drifters. They drift around, and their entire life is based upon just drifting. They have no ability to control where they are except to swim up and down. But they can't decide, oh, I think I'm going to go to Victoria, BC today and check it out. They can't do that, whereas a sardine can. So where the water came from is where the zooplankton came from. Okay, and that's the theme from this talk. So if we look at the circulation a little more detail off the coast here, we see that a lot of the water is heading south. Okay, this is a summertime picture right here. But some water comes across like this and turns this way, and some comes across and turns that way. This little arrow here is a critical arrow because it's bringing water out of the subarctic Pacific down along the coast of Vancouver Island and into the Northern California current. So transport is the word to be used for the currents moving around, and for three reasons. And that's that if the water's coming mostly out of the north here, okay, from the subarctic current, it brings what we call northern species to the Northern California current. If a lot of the water's coming into the California current from offshore, okay, that brings these offshore and kind of subtropical, we call them southern copepod species. So as I say down here, the food chain structure of the entire Northern California current depends upon where the waters come from. So you have to know where the water's coming from first. That's the number one physical question. What causes it to be variable? Because of what it does to the copepods, which are the base of the food chain. Now there's seasonal changes in these coastal currents. Okay, this one right here, to coast. These things actually change direction with the season. So wintertime, we get the currents actually are coming out of the south, and that brings northern species or brings southern species up to the coast of Northern California and Oregon and Washington. When upwelling begins, the winds are blowing to the south, and the currents just suddenly, almost suddenly, within a few days, the currents switch around and they start going south, and that brings northern species into the area. So a really critical issue with us here, up in Oregon at least, and here's I think too, is when did this transition take place? Okay, if it's really early, it means you're bringing these northern species into the system in maybe February or March. If it's really late, it could be as late as July as you bring these northern species into the region. And we had a huge issue in summer 2005 that the food chain didn't transition to this northern type food chain until actually the middle of July. If you know your salmon stories at all, it was the salmon that went to sea in 2005 that didn't come back, which caused the collapse of the whole Sacramento fall Chinook run. That was because of the summer 2005. We didn't have any upwelling until mid-July. The food chain was completely screwed up. It was all these offshore species, etc. So it's a big deal where the water comes from and when this transition takes place. Upwelling. Okay, this is kind of a block diagram of the coast. And so water comes up along the bottom of the ocean, up on the shelf, and comes to the surface and then kind of moves offshore. Okay, it brings fertilizer with it, which is great. It fuels these huge phytoplankton blooms, which the zooplankton eat. The little fish eat the zooplankton, and this goes on for months and months and months on end. Without upwelling, we're basically screwed. But upwelling has a dark side, which I find fascinating, in that the upwelled water itself is actually very, very low in oxygen. Okay, quite low. And it also has low pH, and it has what's called low aragonite saturation values. Aragonite saturation is a measure of when the shells of these little mollusks actually start to dissolve. So the upwelled water is low oxygen and it's acidic. So this is a dilemma with us climate kind of people, that we don't know if upwelling is going to get stronger or weaker. If it gets stronger, is that a good thing or not? We'll get more nutrients and maybe more phytoplankton, but we're going to have lower oxygen and probably a lower pH. So you got this, what do you want to wish for here? Well, you want to wish it to be kind of not changing is what I think, kind of leave the way it is. But it's a real dilemma in the future is we don't know what upwelling is going to do. And we think it's going to get stronger. But if it does, is that going to be good or bad? And it's a problem. We don't know. Okay, this is a slide that'll quickly go over for you what the PDO is. The PDO is a specific decadal oscillation, and what the oscillation is the changes in the water on the eastern Pacific. So this chart shows sea surface temperature anomalies across the whole North Pacific. Blue is cold and red is warm. So you get this temperature pattern where it's blue, which is cold, colder than normal, Gulf of Alaska, California current, and at the equator, and then kind of warm in the middle. Okay, that's the negative PDO, it's called. And the positive PDO is where it's warm in the northeast Pacific, California current, and at the equator, and then cold in the middle. So that's the pattern. The PDO is just a pattern of temperature variability, and it's driven by the winds. So if the basin scale winds, and I'm talking the basin, If the winds are mostly from the south and southwest, it's going to push warm water sort of towards the coast. It's going to cause El Niños at the equator. Whereas if the winds are out of the north or out of the west, whoops, sorry about that, then you get upwelling in the open ocean, and you get cold water here. So depending upon the basin scale winds, you get these different patterns of sea surface temperature. And if you can reduce this index to like a single number, which is what you can do, you can see in this chart here that the red bars are the positive PDO and the blue bars are the negative PDO phase. And this is from this is from 1925 up until this past year. So we had for like 20 years we had mostly warm PDO phase. Okay, so for about 20 years the ocean looked like this. All right, and then it switched, just bang, almost overnight. It switched to negative phase. Darn it, I'll get these. Okay, and you get for like 30 years we had mostly this cold ocean. 1977 it switched back again to the warm phase, and then we switched to cold phase in 1998. Went on for about 5 years. Now right here, I published a paper with this guy Frank Swing declaring that the PDO had gone to a negative phase and will be in that phase for 20 or 30 years. Well, we were wrong, but that's how it goes. But the other thing about the PDO, what's really odd and really troubling, is that it used to be, it would persist for 20 or 30 years in these phases. Now it's gone 5 years cold phase, 5 years warm phase. Now we're 6 years cold phase, and it's going warm phase right now. So it's gone from being this long, low frequency cycle to more of a high frequency cycle, which is pretty scary, as you'll see in my talk a bit later. All right? Because this is an important part of the story as well. So climate change issues that we need to think about are, for salmon, which I won't say much about, but is the fresh water that feeds the rivers going to be from snowpack or from rainfall? It's a huge difference in when the fresh water comes into the rivers and the temperature of the water. Okay. The nature of the basin scale forcing, how does the entire North Pacific basin change in a way that's going to affect us right here off the coast? That involves the PDO and the ENSO. How these gyres in the open ocean gyres might change if they're going to shift north or shift south. We'll get different kind of water coming into the California current. The source water is a big deal, remember? Upwelling, is it strong, and when does it start? Is it going to be stronger in the future and start earlier, or be weaker and start later? These are big issues that we do not know the answers to. Then hypoxia and acidification are things I may not get to today, but you've heard talks on these earlier apparently, so it may not be important to actually get to that stuff. So. And then the biggest problem, which I'm sure Bill will mention to you in his talk, is that everything's getting more variable. The PDOs every 5 years is changing sign. Upwelling is just going nuts. Some years it's super late, some years it's super early. I mean, every year is almost different. And you think, well, this is real interesting. This is really fun. But imagine if you're a fish trying to think, what the hell is going to happen next year? So fish just can't keep up with this stuff. So for salmon, they got some huge problems, and we don't know the answers. Upwelling. Will the ocean get warmer? The PDOs are going to go decadal, or it's going to become goofy and go every 5 years. The central gyre, if that thing expands to the north, are we going to get more tropical water coming into the California current, which is not a good thing? Or will it make upwelling be more productive, which is a whole other idea that's out there now. So, and like I mentioned before, oxygen is getting lower and lower and lower every year. It actually is. So if upwelling is stronger, we're going to get lower oxygen into the system every summer, and we're going to have more and more hypoxia coming up in the future. Guaranteed that. So I'm going to show you one thing right now that I think is pretty amazing. This guy, Nate Mantua, who spoke to you some months ago, or weeks, whenever it was, I don't know. When did Nate talk? Was it?
It was in our March.
March? Okay, yeah. So he published this classical paper that literally has like 3,000 citations. It's incredible. I'm never going to get one like that, I think. But everyone cites that paper because it's so fantastic. And he showed that when the PDO changes sign, like I showed earlier, in those 20-year blocks of time, the salmon catches just go up and down, bang, bang. It's incredible. So I'm going to show you a slide about that. But the point of my talk is going to be that the PDO has a big control over the kinds of copepods we get off the coast. Okay, it's a huge deal. All right, so this is a slide showing the PDO from 1980 up until last year. The top panel is the PDO. Positive phase from 1980 up until 1997, remember, and then went negative for 5 years, positive for 5 years, negative for 6 years. This is the spring Chinook counts at the Bonneville Dam on the Columbia River. And this is the fall Chinook counts at the same place. And you can see, pretty amazingly, that when the PDO is positive, these counts are all below average. Spring Chinook below average, fall Chinook most years below average. The PDO change sign, 2 years later, bang. Huge anomalies, positive anomalies of spring Chinook, and same with the fall Chinook. The PDO goes back to positive, the stocks collapse, not collapse, but the numbers drop way off again, both falls, and then it goes negative again, and the salmon are right back. This past year, they got a world record number of fall Chinook back. 985,000 adults came back. That's twice what they've seen in the past, pretty much. And it's because of the PDO. I mean, it's amazing what it does to salmon. So it's a good thing. Okay, there's some little arrows to help guide your eye to what I just showed you there. So what is it that links the PDO with salmon? All right, it's been a big question for years, from Mantua's work in '97 up until even just recently. So if you look at the PDO, the top panel there, versus the middle panel, which is called the northern copepod anomaly, and the bottom panel, the southern copepod anomaly. So these are the anomalies of the biomass of the northern copepods and the southern copepods. So you can see that when the PDO is in a positive phase, we get negative anomalies of the northern copepods. So there's a lot fewer of them when the PDO is positive. And this is a log scale. This is order of magnitude difference in the biomass of these bugs. When the PDO is positive, we get a lot more of these southern species. Okay? PDOs change its sign, and almost overnight we get strong anomalies of northern species and negative anomalies of southern species. You can see how the pattern goes through the slides here. So PDO changes sign, we get a whole different group of copepods off the coast of Oregon, and this definitely applies to Northern California for sure. Unfortunately, nobody samples zooplankton south of Trinidad, or at least not enough sampling that helps us understand if this is happening further south or not. Okay, so you got that? PDO is positive, southern species are abundant, northern species aren't. So why the heck do we care about this? Well, if you like to see the names of the Latin names, there they are. Pseudocalanus mimus, just rolls off the tongue. Calanus marshalli, okay? So what's different about these animals that seems to maybe affect salmon? It's right here. These warm water subtropical species are they're quite small, and they don't put on lipids. They have virtually no omega-3 fatty acids in them, almost nothing. The cold water taxa are basically, they're big, they're full of what's called waxyesters and these omega-3s. These big guys are just like little bears. They actually hibernate in the winter. So they spend their entire life, such as it is, their simple little life, packing on the fat so they can get through the winter. And since they're packing on the fat, that fat moves up the food chain, then up to salmon. So, and there's a little sac that's inside the animals, and it's incredible. I mean, you can be handling these live animals, and you get this fat on your skin. You gotta you gotta really wash your hands to get this stuff off your skin. It's very I don't know what's the word for fat. It's sticky or whatever. I don't know. Anyhow, so you get very different food chains depending upon what the PDO is doing. Okay. So this is why we watch the PDO so closely, because if it's going to be changing sign every 5 years, you're going to be changing the food chain as often as every 5 years. It's going to mess everything up, et cetera, et cetera. And I see a fat salmon is a happy salmon. That's kind of what I have here. So here's what we think is going on. This is our little cartoon. That during a cold phase of the PDO, we get strong circulation coming down the coast out of the Gulf of Alaska, bringing these northern species down to the coast. Now, this species we get off Oregon, and it's really about as far south as Trinidad. These are species that are really common actually up in the Bering Sea, okay, and the Gulf of Alaska. These are very, very northern species. During the warm phase, we get more water coming in from offshore, okay, or we get a case where the winters are lasting well into the spring, so we're getting, the southern species are coming up from California, from here, in October, and they're hanging around until June and July in some years. So you don't get a very long growing season for these little fat guys. So that's why that's why we work with physicists to help us understand how will the circulation change with climate change. Okay. Slide I love, but I almost never show. Amarita. This is a little mole crabs you have down here. You guys know mole crabs, right? Yeah. Well, these guys live off Oregon only in years when the currents are coming out of the south. Okay, it's pretty cool. So the larvae from down here get brought up to Oregon, and they'll serve as recruits for the adult populations that we have. It's pretty neat. So very much an aside, though. So some of these ideas I've shared with you were published back in 1982 in a classical paper where they figured this out a long time ago about how the currents can be really strong coming across the Pacific and then turning north really strongly, or coming across and turning south strongly. So this is like the cold phase PDO. This is the warm phase PDO. This paper was published in 82 before we even had a PDO. But these guys figured it out, that there was this thing going on way back then, but they didn't know what to call it. Another paper came out, the same kind of deal, these two types of circulation. So these ideas that I've come up with are based on these old papers as well. But this is kind of fun stuff to have found these old classical papers. I forgot about this McGowan paper until recently. Pretty neat. I'll skip this cartoon. So let's see. What do you think, Kurt? Should I go a little longer? It's about,
Yeah, you got time.
a little more? Okay, all right. So a few comments on hypoxia and ocean acidification before I pass the baton over to Bill here. So I've said this to you before, and I'll say it again. So we have these strong upwelling events, and basically what upwelling does to a system. I remind people that it's not the case here, but up in Oregon, people do actually, in fact, water their lawns. And they put fertilizer on their lawns. And the more you water your lawn, you fertilize your lawn, the more it's going to grow. And you grow grass, and you cut it and throw it away or whatever. But in the ocean, it's the same kind of deal. The upwelling brings nutrients to the surface, and it does it there might be 4 or 5 days of upwelling, and it stops for a few days, another 4 or 5 days. You get these huge bursts in nutrients, which then fuels the big phytoplankton blooms, which is the grass, so to speak. Most of that stuff actually falls to the seafloor. It's not eaten by anybody. There's just so much of it, they can't keep up. Falls to the seafloor, decomposes, pulls down the oxygen, and causes hypoxia, and actually releases CO2 because it's actually decomposing, right? So it's putting more CO2 into the water, which then lowers the pH. So this is what I said before. This is the dark side of upwelling. If upwelling is stronger, like some people think it's going to be, that might be the worst thing for us. But again, we really don't know what upwelling is going to do. It's a key feature. So if you look at oxygen off of Oregon, off of Newport, and this is the oxygen concentrations in milliliters per liter. These are units that we use. The dotted line is what indicates the value of hypoxia, which is 1.4 mils per liter. That's right here. And you can see that in the wintertime, it's quite high. Remember, okay, this is the bottom water, okay, about 5 miles off of Newport. Quite high in the winter, but upwelling starts around April or May, and just like that, it just drops down almost nothing. And by July or August, September, we've gotten well below values of 1. There was a measurement made in, I think, late August of 2006 that was actually 0. Over the course of about 1 or 2 days, they actually found anoxia in the waters off of Oregon. Okay. But then upwelling stops in October, and we get the winter storms, mixes up the water, and the oxygen goes back up again. The strong cycle here is driven by the upwelling process, of course. And then if you look at coast-wide, okay, this is Newport right here. This is the mouth of the Columbia River up here, the tip of Washington State. These are data we've taken during our salmon surveys. And this is for the year 2012. This is late May 2012, June of 2012, and September 2012. You can see that the whole coast by September is quite low oxygen. These are values of less than 1.4, almost up in the entire coast. And we've published a paper about this just a few months ago. And if you look at the area of the coast that's covered by this hypoxic water, and then plot the area versus the year, it's actually highly variable, of course, like everything else is. But the thing is that May, on average, about 7% of the shelf is hypoxic. By June, it's 30%, and September, just a little tiny bit higher. So 1/3 of the entire shelf off the northern Oregon Washington is actually hypoxic, 1/3. So with more hypoxia, we're going to get more of the shelf is going to be actually having this kind of low oxygen water. So it's could be a problem for things like clams that really can't move. Fish can swim away; they don't really care. But Dungeness crabs get confused; they don't know which way to go, and they actually die. So, but the maximum was, I think, maybe 2007, whereas almost 2/3 of the shelf was hypoxic in September. It's a lot. Just show you some idea. This is this is 06. I guess it was 06 was the high one. But there's, all this dark blue is really low oxygen water up and down the coast. Another big blob in 07. Other years, nothing. It's interesting how that can happen. 2010, almost not measured anywhere. So it's highly variable. Okay, well, I guess I'll be done in a minute or two here. So here's a little animal called Limacina halcina. This is a pteropod. Have you heard the story about pteropods? This is the poster child for ocean acidification studies. This is a little mollusk that's fed upon heavily by pink salmon. And we have a paper came out just a month or two ago in the Royal Society of London that Nina Bednarsek, this woman here, was the lead author in it. Dick Feely was on it, and I was deep in the list. I don't know where I was, someplace towards the back. But a word I use for these little guys, these are the escargot of the sea. Okay? These are little snails and salmon love to eat. And what Nina has shown, that if you collect pteropods from off the coast of Newport, which is the bottom panel here, you can see these shells are a mess. They're all pitted. That's because of the low pH water. Okay? And these are shells taken from further offshore, but still not that far out that these probably were affected by the low pH water as well. Now, it's not so much the pH, it's what's called aragonite saturation. Okay, these shells are made from aragonite, which is a form of calcium carbonate. All right? So aragonite dissolution is a function of actually the carbonate ion concentration, not so much the pH, but in any case. And is that a problem? Well, I don't know. Here's what we got here. So we took all of our data from Newport Line, and you can estimate aragonite saturation from measurements of temperature, salinity, and oxygen. And we took our data of that type using algorithms that were published by Laura Juranic and Simone Allen. And we got these data to share. Aragonite saturation is shown on this graph here on the y-axis, and this is a value of 1. Any value below 1 will cause these little shells to dissolve. Okay? And this is month of the year, and this is the climatology. This is all the data plotted that we'd ever taken in any July between 1998 and this past year. Every value, and this is the deep water off Oregon, off Newport, every value in July is below 1. That means these shells, if they're in this water, they're going to dissolve. Right now. We have OA problem right now off the coast of Oregon. We're not going to wait for 100 years. We don't have to wait. It's happening right now. August, almost every value except 1. September, most of them are actually below this one line. Same with June. The cool thing is right here. No, where's that slide? It's coming up, I guess. So if you take all the data we have on these pteropods from our zooplankton tows that we did off of Newport, you can see a trend. This little blue line is a trend. There's a trend towards declining concentrations of pteropods off the coast of Oregon right now. So we're already seeing these shells are dissolving, the numbers are declining. Now, does it really matter? That's what we really don't know. If the pteropods are gone from this planet, is anybody going to notice? Pink salmon will, but maybe nobody else. We actually don't know what their role is in the food chain. I'll skip this slide in interest of time here. So if you look at the offshore samples we have, there's no trend whatsoever. The numbers are kind of constant, which suggests that they are in fact going down because of the upwelling process. So some conclusions on this pteropod section here is that we get more zero samples in the summertime. Numbers are going down summer and fall. But the problem is we don't know where these things live in a water column. Are they living in the surface waters? Are they living down deep? When do they spawn? All this stuff, we have no idea about the details. And of course, the role in the food chain. But It's kind of fun to be on top of this problem because, like I say, this is a poster child for ocean acidification studies, and we don't know anything about their biology. It's kind of those odd things where we're telling Congress that if these animals disappear, pink salmon are going to be in trouble. It's like, oh, I wouldn't say it quite that way, but we got to be careful what we say at times about this stuff to not be too extreme. So the last slide I think is here. Yeah, this is for Bill Sydeman actually. So this is the recognized saturation at NH25 down deep, and that cycle is what's called the NPGO, North Pacific Gyre Oscillation. It tracks it beautifully. We don't know why, and you don't know why either, probably, but anyhow. Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah, it is nice. What this gyre oscillation is remember that earlier slide I showed you of the whole North Pacific? There's these two gyres that are coming across. Some are going north and one goes south. Well, those gyres can actually spin faster or spin slower. And if they spin up, I think that's the positive phase of NPGO. If they spin down, that's the negative phase. I'm not sure about that. But in any case, something to do with the entire North Pacific gyres can impact these little pteropods right off the coast of Oregon. So I'll stop with this slide here just to let you know that there's a big El Nino coming. We're probably going to know at the end of maybe early July whether it's going to be huge or just big, but if something's going on at the equator, it's pretty scary. And I got this off the web yesterday or Monday, I guess it was. So what you can see, if you remember what I told you about, cold in the middle, warm over here, what's this PDO phase? Positive, right? So when you get positive PDO and you get an El Nino, you get this double whammy. So that's where we are right now. So I'm going to stop. I got more slides, but I'm going to quit right here, I think. And you want to do questions now, Kurt, or just wait till Bill reps does his?
We can just do both talks.
Okay, all right, that's fine. Yeah. So let me finish off with my what I call my friends. I read a lot of proposals because that's kind of what you do with as a professional marine scientist. And these are the people that funded my work, and I always give them a lot of thank yous. So, okay, Bill, you want to hop up and. That's for me, not you.
I'm going to go back to Bill's last slide, I think.
You got to go back a ways to find it because it's I jumped a few.
Up barrel.
Up barrel. Nothing.
It's the wrong. There we go. Use these little guys. Those ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah. All right. Thank you all for coming today. It's very nice to be here, and thanks, Kurt, for organizing the class. And so I just wanted to start here because one of the things that Bill didn't mention is that there's one little spot where it's actually cold still right now with this really looking like a very large El Nino that's brewing, and that's right off the Northern California coast, which if you look at that figure very, very carefully, you can see that there's a little bit of blue right there, and those are cold ocean temperatures due to upwelling.
You need to use the mouse. The people on WebEx can't see it.
Yeah.
So you this mouse is tricky. You gotta use this like 3-fingered thing. You gotta do that, and then you do this. There you go.
Right there. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, but you got that? It's
All right.
gotta be able to.
Anyway, so right in here, there's still quite a bit of upwelling along the Northern California coast, and that's a good thing for our region. But it's really the only place where we're seeing sort of cool temperatures at this point in time. And let's see, am I going the right direction, or am I going?
You're doing fine.
Okay, there's Bill's friends again.
Yeah.
Thank all of you people for funding Bill's research. Okay, so Bill talked a lot about climate variability, and in particular this interdecadal variability that's related to the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And I knew Bill was going to do that because Bill and I have done these sorts of things back to back before. And so what I'm going to try to do is talk a little bit more about what are the sort of unidirectional changes that we're seeing in climate, and how is the marine ecosystem in California responding to that. So this is an image, NASA image that I usually use for these climate change talks because it really just shows you the globe and how warm it is. And a lot of that heat of course, is in the oceans. And the oceans are absorbing most of the heat that we're putting into the system. One of the things when we think about the oceans in terms of the Earth and in terms of climate change that I really like to start with are these facts, just very basic facts, that over 71% or over 70% of the Earth is covered by ocean. And that includes 92% of all the habitats on the planet. And so when we think about climate change and the effects on the environment, we really need to be looking at what's going on in ocean ecosystems, but we've tended not to do that. And so if we think about the last Intergovernmental Panel report on climate change, which was published in 2007, this was recently updated, but there were about 90,000 time series or records of changes in the environments globally that were looked at, but less than 1% came from aquatic systems. So we're doing a good job at looking at what the impacts may be of climate change, but we're looking at those impacts mainly in terrestrial systems, and that's not good enough. So the assessment report 5 was just released a couple of months ago, and there is a new chapter, it's chapter 30, on the oceans, and so we're just now starting to really build up the information base on, from a global perspective on what's happening with climate change in the oceans. Up until now, it's been pretty deficient. So this image should be review for everybody, having gone through some other classes. What is the evidence of global warming? Is everything okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Or anthropogenic global warming, the evidence. So this comes from the 4th assessment report, again published in 2007. And what you see here are these 3 different panels. See if I can get this right. We have information about the globe overall, including land and marine and ocean habitat. This is the information on land. This is the information on the global ocean. The black line shows the observations. And you can see there's a very similar pattern of change, of increasing temperatures globally up until the late 1940s, early 1950s. A reduction in temperature, a little hiatus, if you will, in global warming in the 50s before it starts to increase again through the present time. So the black line is the observations. The pink shading shows the models that have been developed that include both natural, so in other words, the PDO and ENSO, as well as the human forcings, whereas the blue shows what the model results without the anthropogenic, without the human input. And what you can see here is that clearly only the models that use both the natural variability, like the PDO, and the human input in terms of global warming are reproducing the observations. So fundamentally, this is what people are using to show that the global warming that we're seeing, the planetary warming, is due to what humans are doing. I don't know if you've gone over that before, but I think this is pretty compelling evidence, and it is the primary thing that people are looking about. So perhaps some of you have heard about the recent global warming hiatus, and so I thought I'd make a few comments about that. And this is just a slide showing average monthly sea surface temperatures taken from the Farallon Islands over the period shown there, 1960 to 2003. And you can see there's a lot of scatter. There's a line in the middle which just shows the trend, basically. So it was going up, and then it dropped off a little bit in the early 2000s. And since that point in time, it's come up again. But if you look at this a little more carefully, you can sort of fit more of a sine wave through the data. And that actually fits the data a lot better than just that trend line does. But overall, we're getting this increase. So just like what's happening globally, I think we can think about locally in terms of global warming and ocean warming, kind of like the stock market. This might not be a great analogy, but I like to use it because people think about the stock market. So we know that we'd like to see an increase. We don't really know that we want to see an increase in in ocean temperatures or planetary temperatures. But there are these fluctuations. These fluctuations are related to things like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation that Bill talked about. So there are these reversals. There are periods of hiatuses where things aren't going to go in the direction of expectation. But overall, we have an increasing trend. So one of the things that we shouldn't do is we shouldn't expect always that the trend is going to be in one direction. If we see a fluctuation for a while, that's just that's natural fluctuations that are due to the natural part of the system. Okay, but overall there are these long-term trends. So thinking about this from the standpoint of the stock market analogy again, the big question is, should we invest? Okay, well, whether or not to invest is really due to your perspectives, but it also depends on our understanding of the socio-ecological system and the impacts, and so that's what I'm going to talk about as we go on. You just saw this slide that Bill presented earlier, and so I'm going to break it down into three different regions of the North Pacific. These are the large marine ecosystems that you're probably all familiar with. Shown there, encompassed by that the red line as the California Current. This is very similar to a slide that Bill showed. And then the Gulf of Alaska, shown in blue, and then the central North Pacific Gyre, which is encompassed by the pink. And these three ecosystems, again, as Bill was mentioning earlier, there's interactions between them. The currents that Bill described, the North Pacific Current, the California Current, they bring things from different ecosystems. They sort of make all these ecosystems interact with one another. So one of the big questions we have is, how is that going to change with climate change? So again, this is probably a review, but if we think just about the California Current, large marine ecosystem, what are its primary physical attributes? If we want to understand what's going to happen in the future, we have to think about sort of how does the system function, if you will. So California Current system, again, is primarily the west coast of the United States, which is shown there. And there's the California Current that Bill just described. And the California Current itself can be considered sort of a river in the sea, if you will, and it brings waters and plankton from the Gulf of Alaska, so this is interaction between these systems, southward down into or along the west coast. And that's what brings those fatty copepods into the system that Bill was just talking about. There are also coastal promontories such as Cape Mendocino, Point Arena, Point Conception down to the south, and these are centers of upwelling. And I'm going to talk quite a bit more about upwelling than what Bill did earlier. So this is a satellite image shown here of upwelling along the coastline, and you can see these cold coastal waters that are associated with the upwelling centers, or upwelling cells, if you will, at various locations where there are coastal promontories. This is Cape Mendocino here, here's Point Arena, here's Point Reyes. So there's a very large upwelling cell, which we refer to as the Point Arena to Point Reyes upwelling cell right off the region here. I'm going to focus more on this area as we go on. So to understand the ecosystem impacts, we really need to ask the question, what is the future of these factors that impact this ecosystem here? First of all, regional upwelling. Talk more about that quite a bit. That's why that one starred. Large-scale California Current dynamics. This is not very well known. We understand that there's this thing called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. We don't understand a lot of the physical aspects that drive that variability. I'm not going to talk about that too much. And the interaction between the currents and upwelling. Upwelling operates or mixes the waters that are brought into the system on those currents. Those are source waters. So the second and the third part are very complicated, and it's an area of developing research. So I'm going to focus mostly on regional upwelling and what do we know about this. So as Bill mentioned, again, showed a very similar slide. This is a cartoon of the upwelling process, and probably you've all seen things like this before, but the winds blow along shore, and these are the northwesterly winds that tend to blow hardest during May and June in this area each year. So here's the California coastline, if you will, and you have winds coming along shore, and with the Coriolis force that's spinning the Earth on its axis, that causes water to be shunted offshore, which then allows water from the depths to come up to the surface, which brings nutrients and other things, and that's what stimulates the food web dynamics that, again, that Bill was talking about previously. So what is going to happen with upwelling in the future? I threw in a few photographs here just for people to make it real, I suppose. This was just a few weeks ago. I think it was on May 6th. A photograph taken by Ron LaValle, a wonderful photographer that lives up in Mendocino, off of Mendocino Head with some seabirds starting to breed right there. And we've all seen this. And this is the time when you avoid going out in the ocean in a boat, right? So, but this is actually the process. So when you can't get out into the water, that's when the ocean's being most productive. That's what upwelling looks like. Here's another photograph contributed by my daughter, Claire, who's in the audience. And again, of the upwelling process off the Sonoma coast just a few weeks ago. And so this happens very near to shore, but it's the kind of thing that you can actually observe. And if you think about it, over the last few years, you've probably, every time you've been out to the coast, you're probably shaking your head going, oh my God, it's so windy. So that's been going on now for quite some time. And again, this is what these upwelling cells look like. This is showing the cell, the Point Arena to Point Reyes cell, and again, really cold waters right along in this area, right off the Russian River and areas to the south. Here's San Francisco Bay. There's another upwelling cell off Davenport around Monterey Bay, and then a cell down here off Big Sur. So these are these areas where upwelling is really intense. So a number of years ago, in 1990, there was this wonderful hypothesis that was put forth by Andy Backen. And the title of his paper was Global Climate Change and Intensification of Coastal Ocean Upwelling. And this was, I believe, one of the first hypotheses that were really put out there about climate change and these coastal upwelling systems, such as the one off California. And Backen said in this paper that a mechanism exists whereby global greenhouse warming could, by intensifying wind stress on the ocean surface, lead to an acceleration of coastal upwelling. Now, of course, we've learned since that point in time, which we didn't know in 1990, that this is also responsible for hypoxia, is also responsible for ocean acidification. So as Bill mentioned, there's kind of a downside to this whole thing. But at the time when this paper was written, everybody was thinking about, oh, increased nutrient input, that's a good thing. The effects of enhanced upwelling on the marine ecosystem are uncertain, but they're potentially dramatic. So this is a really interesting hypothesis. It involves global warming. It involves atmospheric science in terms of winds. It involves oceanography, physical oceanography, the process of upwelling, and it also involves marine ecology. All tied together in a fairly straightforward conceptual explanation, which I'll go on about a little more. So this is what Andy Backen proposed. As Bill mentioned, I think earlier, the winds along the coast are driven by a high pressure system over the ocean, that's the North Pacific High, and a low pressure system over the desert southwest, that's the continental low, desert south low. The gradient between the high and the low, winds are going to go downhill, and so that gradient between those two systems is what drives the coastal winds, which is what drives the upwelling. So what Backen proposed is that there would be differential heating of the air over the land relative to the ocean. There's going to be more heating of the air temperature rather than the ocean temperature because water resists heating, whereas air doesn't. When that would happen, there would be a strengthening of this low pressure system over this desert southwest, increasing the gradient between the high pressure system and the low pressure system, which would result in more wind and more upwelling. So it's sort of, if I just toggle back and forth, this is basically what he was suggesting, was that this low pressure system was going to intensify. Now, we have a paper that's about to come out in Science Magazine sometime in the next month probably, and I can't show you the images from that because right now the paper was just accepted and it was embargoed which means we can't share it until it actually comes out of the magazine. But the evidence for this wind intensification hypothesis in the California system, in the system off South Africa, and in the Peru system is actually pretty strong and in support of Bakken's ideas. Off of the one other system, where another major upwelling system, it doesn't look like it's happening. So 3 out of the 4 systems look like there is upwelling intensification, which on the one hand could be very good because it brings more nutrients into the system. On the other hand, though, as we just saw, more acidification, more hypoxia, and more turbulence in general. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a good thing. But in relation to that hypothesis, there are some other data that we can take a look at. This is known as the velocity of climate change, and you can think of that as how fast is the climate impact changing in the ocean environment. So this is from a paper by Mike Burrows et al. In Science a couple of years ago. And again, I want to point out there are areas of ocean cooling. This is over a 50-year period, 1960 to 2010. And you can see off our area, northern part of California and Oregon, Bill's region, that this indicates ocean cooling of about 0.2 to 0.3 degrees over per decade in this region. There are some other regions in the United States where it's getting a lot warmer off the northeastern United States. Rapid warming in that region, rapid warming in the Gulf of California, and you look down here, let's say in Patagonia, and you're getting cooling along the coast, but rapid warming further offshore. So there's lots of differences going on in terms of what the patterns are. It's not straightforward warming everywhere. But here we're seeing cooling. That's also in accordance with this upwelling intensification idea. Another image showing recent ocean cooling over in the Northeast Pacific over the past, I think this is 30 years. Boy, I should put down the time series then. So you can see cooling here along, again, the West Coast, even some up into the Gulf of Alaska and in the Central Pacific. There's really a question, though, how long is this going to last? And this is really sort of a complicated and busy slide, but I thought we'd just try to work through this a little bit because this is information that was taken in our backyard. This is some work that we did to support the monitoring of the newly created MPAs in California. So this is sort of about the oceanographic background of for the marine protected area monitoring. And so this is from a paper that came out earlier this year in Progress in Oceanography. And we have here information about wind stress. And these are principal components of wind stress in a bunch of different locations. Also sea surface temperature in a bunch of different locations, sea level in a bunch of different locations, and salinity in a bunch of different locations along the central northern California coast. And if we just look at wind stress, so wind is what's creating the upwelling, and then sea surface temperature, we can see here that blue line shows the variability that's at that monthly scale of the data. And for example, in this recent period here of, let's say, 2007 through 2010 or so, there was a period of very strong winds, and that corresponded to a period of colder temperatures. But what you can also see here is that there's a lot of interaction between months or between years. And so there's a lot of what we call autocorrelation in the data set, in that conditions in 1 month or 1 year are also reflective of conditions in the next few months or the next few years. So there's a lot of variability, but these are also in accordance with some of these ideas about upwelling intensification. You also note that when there's strong winds and cold temperatures, there's also a decrease in sea level. So if you look at the sea level record from San Francisco Bay, which is one of the longest records that we have, there's a long-term trend, but over the last 20 years, when upwelling has gotten stronger, that change in sea level has flattened off. So if you look at that record, that should help to explain why that's happening. We can take all these data and put them together in what we've been calling the Multivariate Ocean Climate Index. And so this is all the information that we have on winds, temperature, salinity, the PDO, the El Nino, the Multivariate ENSO Index, everything taken together and crunched using multivariate statistics. And these are seasonal, each point reflects a season there. And you can see there, again, lots of variability. This is just over the past 20 years or so, just focusing in on what's been happening recently. But you can see there are these sequences, you know, in the early 1990s where it was cold and then it got really warm. Get this thing working again. A cold period that started in the late 1999 and continued until almost the end of 2002. Then we went through a warm period into 03, 04, 05, 06 a little bit, and then it dropped off, and then recently we've been in this cold period. So as Bill mentioned earlier, we're getting a lot of variability in the system. It's not quite reflecting what the Pacific Decadal Oscillation used to be. It's more reflecting variability on a 3 to 4 year time scale. So I call all of this climate change schizophrenia because it's really getting much more complicated and much more variable. And Bill said early in the talk that I was going to talk about variation and how things are getting more variable, and here we go. So I finally got there after 20 minutes or so. So in terms of the physical environment, we're getting lots of variability. Serial autocorrelation, this condition, adjacent years or adjacent months having similar conditions, there's lots of that going on. There really are at the moment few clear patterns of what we would think of as unidirectional change. And the reason for that, for better or for worse, is that we live and work and pay attention to a really dynamic ecosystem here. It is just changes, I mean, it changes on a daily time scale. And so it's really, it's just difficult to see those unidirectional changes. In the central Northern California region, upwelling winds, they do appear to be increasing. Sorry, I can't show you all of that right now, but pay attention to the magazine, it'll be out shortly. We don't understand the physical basis of that yet. We need to look more into that. But these patterns that we're describing, they're all dependent upon the length of study. And in particular, this really suggests that right now, while we're getting global warming signals, and we're getting global warming signals that are affecting biology, that the decadal scale is still dominating. Okay, because otherwise we wouldn't be seeing that the patterns are dependent upon the length of study. There'd just be one constant change, and we're not really seeing that yet. So that's where we're at with the kind of the physical side of things. So social and ecological impacts. I'm not going to talk about the social side of things at all. I do want to talk a little bit more about upwelling and this idea about too much upwelling, or that upwelling has a dark side. So a long time ago, I guess it was like in 1989, there was a paper that was published on the South African upwelling system and the recruitment of small pelagic fish there by Philippe Curie, and he came up with this idea that there was an optimal environmental window, or an OEW, for upwelling, and that the recruitment or the productivity of fish, in particular he was interested in anchovies and sardines, was best at moderate levels of upwelling. So too little upwelling and you didn't have enough nutrient input into the system. Too much upwelling and you got increased turbulence, which can cause a decrease in the trophic linkages, the feeding ecology of the animals, or just transport the plankton off the shelf. Now to this we can add increased hypoxia and ocean acidification. At the time when that paper was written, again, those two issues were not apparent. So this optimal environmental window, though, still has an application for looking at how upwelling is going to change with climate change and how it's going to affect the ecosystem. Another complexity here, again, coming back to this idea that upwelling occurs at distinct locations along the coastline. It's not everywhere. Okay, it occurs at these coastal promontories. So we have lots of spatial variability in the environment. Again, this very dynamic, this very intricate system, if you will. And so there's going to be a lot of variability in ecosystem responses. And so here's a couple points where upwelling is very strong at Point Arena and at Point Sur. San Francisco Bay and Monterey Bay in between. And this image from a paper by Marisol Garcia Reyes and John Largier at BML a couple of years ago shows that the strongest upwelling is occurring right at these locations. So the blue there is showing really strong upwelling. So spatial variability. Then on top of this physical variability that we've got, we have this ridiculous biological complexity of the system. It's a very productive system, but it's also very, very complex. So Bill showed, I don't know how many species of copepod that you discussed, maybe 5 or 6? And how many species of copepods are there in the system?
This system?
This system, 200. Yeah, right. So just scratching the surface, that's just copepods. How many species of krill? I think you talked about 1, and there's 40,
Yeah.
right? There's 100 species of seabirds. There's 50 species of marine mammals. Fish, David, how many species of fish are in California current? I'm going to put you on the spot because you're here.
You know, I'm going to defer to one of our marine colleagues, like maybe Erickson. What do you think?
How about a debate? Let's see what it is.
In any event, we're dealing with an incredible amount of biological complexity. And all of these species interact. It's not just the simple thing of one species being affected by climate change. So, you know, we have a real challenge. And just as an example here, we could put forth this hypothesis that changes in seabirds reflect changes in the forage base, small fish, copepods that are linked to climate, so these oceanic atmospheric interactions. And if we look at the effects of climate, we may think about global climate warming as kind of a troubling trend, if you will, or could be, whereas these other things that are going on are more like meandering variability, but they're also creating this complexity. So what are some of the hypothetical effects that we could see in terms of biological things? Again, this is probably review, but I thought I'd go over it. Species range expansions and range contractions. There are changes in physiological functions, and a lot of those may be related to ocean acidification or hypoxia. Obviously, respiration of animals that are experiencing hypoxia is going to be reduced. There's also an idea that respiration of animals could be reduced by ocean acidification. There can be changes in the timing of events. We talked about the timing of upwelling, but there are also these timing of biological events. When do salmon actually enter the ocean? What time of year do seabirds reproduce? So all of these sorts of things are potential sort of ecological impacts, if you will. Now, if you have changes in species distributions and you have changes in their physiological functions, you have changes in their timing, which may or may not be adaptive, what that's going to do is change the ecological landscape. It's going to change the ecological interactions. It's going to change the predator-prey interactions, just as the interactions that Bill was talking about between salmon and copepods, or salmon and krill. Those changes, those ecological interactions, are going to affect the demography, the vital rates, the reproductive success, the survival of populations, and ultimately communities, and the structure of those communities. And what we're seeing right now is there really are changes in community structure more so than changes in, let's say, the absolute abundance of many populations. This example was, I think, one of the first that was published about redistribution of copepods. Copepods have been featured in lots and lots of climate change research around the globe. This shows the impacts of ocean warming in the Northeast Atlantic over 2 different time periods, 1960 to 63 and 96 to 99. And like Bill's Northern Copepod Index, Beaugrand et al. Created what he called a cold water or subarctic copepod group. And in the 60s, they occurred down into the North Sea. This is Great Britain here and Ireland, and down into the North Sea and across the, the Northwest or Northeast Atlantic. And in 96 through 99, all of these species are gone. So it's just dominated by these warm water copepods that have come up into this part of the system. And so the productivity of this system has generally changed because the cold water species that contain those fats that Bill was talking about earlier, they've disappeared. So this is the kind of stuff that, that could happen. California, climate change canaries, if you will. There's a bunch of them. We've already talked about some. But krill are we do a lot of work on krill together, so you're going to hear about krill. Some of the birds, Cassin's auklet is a planktivorous seabird that I've done a lot of work on, and it's a very good indicator, sentinel, and then salmon. And ultimately, of course, we're interested in how the changes that we're seeing in biological populations are these things that we can also see in our fisheries. Bill's work on the Newport line is shown up here. This is his site of long-term ocean studies. There are a lot of data sets that are available. But I will say that none of the data sets that are available kind of do everything at one place. So if you want to try to put things together, completely, like the whole ecosystem, from phytoplankton to zooplankton, to fish, to birds, to mammals, to humans, you can't do it anywhere because we don't have that kind of data. What we do have is lots of information. Our Mexican colleagues studying down off Baja as part of the IMOCOCAL survey, the California Cooperative Fisheries Investigation survey off Southern California goes up to Monterey Bay at certain times of year. And the Trinidad Head line is a new study area up off Trinidad, and then Bill's work off the Newport line. So, and that's just some of them. There's lots of points where people are doing work as well. So this D points to an island off of the tip of Cape Flattery there in Washington, where seabirds are studied at Tatoosh Island. And F here shows the Farallon Islands off the Gulf of the Farallons. And H is the Channel Islands. So we have a lot of information, or potentially have a lot of information, but we need to put it together. One of the things that people are talking a lot about is tropicalization of the California current. We have a system that's half subarctic and half subtropical, if you will, in terms of the overall distribution. We're dealing with a very large area that expands many degrees of latitude. So there could be this general increase in southern species and a general decrease in northern species. There are some good signals that this is happening. Probably the best example is coming from the expansion of Humboldt squid into Northern California, and I believe into Oregon as well, over the last 10 to 15 years or so. The population is kind of going back and forth, but they're still in the system. These are voracious predators, and they have major impact on the ecological interactions that are going on out there, despite the fact that people like to go out and catch them. I think it's fun to pull up a 50-pound squid. So, but that's an example of a species that really is subtropical or tropical in its distribution that has moved up into the subarctic California current. Other points of interest. There are these living laboratories that we have at various islands. This is the Farallon National Wildlife Refuge, Southeast Farallon Island shown there. We also have Channel Islands National Park. We also have the newly created marine protected areas. These are points, but if we can do biological studies, long-term biological studies at those points, and we can relate it to the larger climate signal, we're going to start learning things about what's happening with the changes in the ecosystem. Some of the species that provide pretty good information about what's going on with the food web, Bill's copepods, the salmon that Bill's also studying. This is an image of a Cassin's auklet. These are a really small bird that eat krill primarily, about 80% of their diet. This is a species that's studied at a few sites along the west coast. Cassins feed on krill, as I just said, so they are also interact with blue whales. So we go from one of the smallest organisms in the California current to the largest organism in the California current, blue whales. These are blue whales and feeding on krill swarms in Monterey Bay. So there's a big question, as we talked about earlier, like how is krill going to change? Another species of seabird that I'm a seabird guy, so I have to have my bird pictures in here. But common murre with a northern anchovy. So if we want to understand what's going on with murres, we really need to understand what's going on with their prey base, which includes anchovies and other small species of fish. The murres, like salmon, feed on these anchovies as well. So if we start to understand something about murres, that's going to tell us something about some of these other species that we're interested in. So, again, this is a complicated slide. I'll try to walk you through it, at least on some level. This is information from a paper from Brian Wells that was published in Cal Coffee Reports last year, and this is the State of the California Current Report. Every year, there is a State of the California Current Report, and for those of you who want to track what's going on in the California Current on an annual basis, that is really a good paper to read. So take a look at it. It includes data from lots of different sources and lots of different, on lots of different trophic levels. So this shows the pattern of variability of these breeding birds on the Farallon Islands. There are 8 different species here. So this is the kind of information that you want to look at to kind of get a handle on what's going on. And if you think about it, you know, you can focus just on one species, but if you focus on one species in a system that's as complicated as ours, you might get very misleading results. So here's an example of kind of an approach, if you will, that you might want to look at. So, boy, let's see. I need to move along. So there's 8 species here, and let's just take them one by one. So this one here, if you look at that time series, you can see that there's not really a consistent pattern of change in their productivity. So there's no real trend here, but there is this surprise in that in the last 5 years, there's been very, very poor productivity of these cormorants. Okay, here's another cormorant, and there really is no trend in this data set either, but what you can see if you draw a line like halfway through the time series is that the variance structure of the data has changed. So in the early part of the 70s and 80s, every other year they either were really successful or they failed in their breeding success. But over the last few years, we're getting a change in that structure, and now we're getting more autocorrelation in the data where we'll have 4 years of high productivity followed by 4 years of low productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So the variability in the system is changing. This is a time series for a gull, and what we can see here is there's just a steady decline in their productivity. So if you just looked at the gulls, you might say, wow, climate change is having a big impact on this system. But when you put it in the context of all the other species, you don't see that. Here's the common murre. This is a species where, again, there's no real decline. There might be a slight decline in the productivity, but there was a surprise in 05-06. This was a reduction in productivity that was not associated with El Nino, and again in 09. This species here, there's no trend, but again, the variance structure in the time series is changing. So here we went up, down, in this part of the time series, and here we're getting more autocorrelation. 4 years of good productivity, 5 years of bad productivity. This is another species, rhinoceros auklet. No trend, no surprises, nothing interesting. This is the most interesting one, Cassin's auklet. That's why I tend to focus on it. So we don't really see a trend. If you run a regression line through these points, there's no trend in the mean values of their reproductive success. It's constant. But definitely there's a change in variance, and in fact, in this case, the variability of the auklets is getting greater. There are also constant surprises. So when does a constant surprise not be a surprise? I don't know. Anyway, so we had a surprise in 01-02, very high reproductive success. You know, these are the times when, as an ecologist, you sit up and you go, geez, what's going on here? 05-06, there was failure, no explanation. And then recently, again, their productivity is getting even higher. So all kinds of surprises. Every year we're seeing surprises. We love surprises. Keeps it fresh, keeps it interesting. There's another species here, slight decline, nothing going on really. So, you know, what do you make of this? There's just a lot of changes. But one thing is there seem to be more surprises. And there is more ecological variability, if you will. So these surprises, I think, are something that we should be focusing on. We can only get a handle on surprises if we have long-term monitoring. So those places where we have long-term monitoring, we have to keep them going. We have to get the funding for it, and there are places where we need to be doing long-term monitoring that we don't have funding for yet. The marine protected areas are very interesting. It's like 2 years of monitoring here, 2 years of monitoring there. We kind of need to pick maybe 1 or 2 of those. I'm looking at Brett right now, and let's just focus on those areas for a long period of time and do that kind of work. Anyway, so these surprises are very important. We get signals from auklets. We can link to other protected species such as salmon and whales and things like that. I think I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. We talked a little bit about krill. The surprises that we're seeing are related, we think, to more mismatching in the trophic interactions, the feeding interactions in the ecosystem. And this is an idea that was put forth a long time ago, that fish do better when their timing of their reproduction is oriented with the timing of their prey. So that these two things happen at the same time. So under optimal conditions, if you will, so not climate change, there would be a small mismatch. So, or lots of overlap, if you will, between the timing of when the fish need their food or when the birds need their food and the availability of their food. Now, what's been happening with changes in timing is that, let's say, a phytoplankton's getting earlier in their productivity, but the zooplankton that feed on them is getting later, so there's a larger mismatch, creating less of an overlap between the predators, even if it's a krill predator and its prey. So this is creating more temporal asynchrony, if you will, between these two things. So this is one of the explanations, we think, for why we're seeing all these different changes that are very, very difficult to understand. Each of these species has their own match and mismatch. So this image was put together for a paper published a few years ago by Scott Doney et al. In the annual review of marine systems. And it's a summary, if you will, at that time of what we thought the main biological impacts were in the California current. And sort of go through things here because this is kind of my wrap up. We're seeing increased upwelling winds on the shelf. We're seeing decreasing in some cases and more variable seabird breeding success. We're also seeing shifts in seabird and invertebrate community structure from a colder water community to more warm water communities. This is leading, actually, the changes in upwelling and ocean temperatures leading to more primary productivity, but that primary productivity doesn't necessarily translate up the food web. At the time when we wrote this, decreased zooplankton with earlier seasonal peak, I think we want to cut that one off the list right now, but maybe that's something we can discuss with Bill a little bit earlier. At the time when this was written, I think that was really something that we thought was going on. I'm not sure that we agree with that any longer. Increased upwelling of low oxygen and high CO2 waters and high nutrient waters, of course, that's leading to greater ocean acidification and hypoxia. Declining salmon populations. Again, this was after the crash of the salmon population at that point in time. So I think at this point, I probably want to change that to at least more variable salmon populations. I don't know if we still think that they're declining. I mean, overall they have, but at least there's been some recovery. Also crossed out this decreased benthic fish productivity because after this was published, the fish productivity started to increase. Increased invasion of jumbo squid. Changes in rockfish distribution from deeper to shallower waters. Increase in the mesopelagic fish. This is off of Southern California, of myctophids and lanternfish and things like that. And an increase in krill-related upwelling. And I think we have at least one more change, that in terms of the Humboldt squid, there have been fewer recently, but they're still in the system. And in terms of these offshore fish, there also are fewer recently. So, you know, that's basically a summary of what's been going on in the system. Just a comment here back to low frequency variability, the PDO and things like it. It really is making things very difficult in terms of allowing us to be conclusive in terms of what's going on in the system. This is really the big issue in my mind. This panel shows a figure on seabirds and the abundance of their prey off Southern California, paper that we published earlier this year. You can see here there's synchrony or covariance between these two time series. The birds are declining, the abundance of the fish prey are declining, but this just includes the period of 1986 to 2012, which is shown here. And this is the abundance of anchovy and sardine, and here's 1986, right about here. So if you look at that, you can see that there's been, over the last 20 years, there's been this decline in the abundance of larval anchovy. But if you put this into context of their overall population trend, they increased in the 50s and 60s, up to peaks in the early 1970s, and have been decreasing since then. So is this a long-term pattern of change, or is this a long-term decline, or is this just interdecadal variability? It really is a problem. With this is the one reason where it's hard to be definitive about things. I mentioned earlier, this focus on upwelling, but upwelling is also related to to the currents. And again, Bill discussed that and went over that carefully, and related to the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. One of the things that has been found by colleagues in Hawaii is that there's been an expansion of this oligotrophic waters, these low productivity waters of the North Pacific Gyre. Okay, the North Pacific Gyre is also known as the garbage patch. So when people talk about the garbage patch, they're talking about plastics out here. So this region, though, which is encircled by the currents that Bill went over, the North Pacific Current, the California Current, the North Equatorial Current, and the Kuroshio Current off Japan, this region is expanding. These are low nutrient, low productivity waters. What is that effect going to be on our system? We don't really know. So take-home conclusions in terms of the science that we have so far. Upwelling winds are increasing. Population variability is increasing. And what that means from a management perspective or a policy perspective is there's less predictability in the system. That means it's going to be more difficult to manage. There is some evidence, although it's fairly limited, of tropicalization, if you will, of the community, the expansion of warm water species. And so far, at least, the interdecadal variability is dominating the dynamics. Bill, can I grab that water?
Sure.
Okay, in terms of future questions, where's the science going in the future? We really need to know, how is climate change going to affect the natural modes of, or the modes of natural variability we see in the system? That's a huge question. Are things going to get to be more El Nino-y or more positive phases of the PDO? Will novel ecosystem states evolve? In other words, a warm state where you're still getting more upwelling. How will other human impacts interact with climate change? In other words, coastal development, fisheries, pollution. All of these things have an impact as well. There's complexity there. And how are we going to predict ecosystem responses with really what we call no analog climate states? And will species adapt to these states? And then, of course, how are we going to adapt to the new ecosystem structure? A couple of comments here. We think a lot about these redistribution of fisheries. I think the question really is, what will my backyard contain, rather than where should I go to fish? Excuse me. And from a conservation perspective, are the protected areas protecting what we think they're protecting? I had to put this picture in because I love it. Some colleagues in Japan, and you know, the idea is that we really need to work together to do these kinds of interdisciplinary studies. And I'm about to lose my voice, so I'll say thank you.